So I want to talk about the Federal Trade Commission's recent decision to ban what are called non-compete clauses. And this is going to get a little in the weeds, so apologies in advance for the legalese. But this week, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, voted to support a ban on what are called non-compete clauses in contracts. And what those do is they limit competition, according to the Federal Trade Commission, because folks can't sort of move around as easily in work that they might want to be doing. So the thing that I think is important to recognize is that this will not be immediate. The Chamber of Commerce has already sued to stop this from being implemented. And I would not be surprised if they're able to, at the district court level, stop the non-compete regulation from moving forward. And I'm sure they'll litigate all the way up to the Supreme Court. And why that matters is we are dealing with a recent Supreme Court case that addresses something called Chevron deference. And Chevron deference comes from a case that happened multiple decades ago, where the Supreme Court decided there are all these federal agencies, right? There's the Health and Human Services Department, there's CMS underneath HHS, there's the Defense Department, there's all these different federal bodies that are really under the executive branch. And the way that the law works, according to Chevron, is courts relatively often recognize their limitations, and they believe that these federal agencies, the EPA, the FAA, they have a lot of experts that they can rely on and turn to. And so what Chevron deference says is that courts and other litigants generally have less expertise than the federal agencies do. So we're going to defer to what the federal agencies do when it's sort of an even tie in terms of information that's brought forward in a court case. So the judges recognize that they have to be an inch thick and a mile wide in terms of their knowledge of the law. They're not going to know what particulate matter matters for lead exposure or whatever. But there are folks who are scientists and others at these agencies that are going to have that expertise. What the current case that the Supreme Court is deciding will do is decide whether or not to get rid of Chevron deference and rejigger the entire federal government, or at least a significant portion of it, to not allow them to sort of automatically win when the scales are balanced. So not only is the Chamber of Commerce going to bring suit, and has brought suit actually, I think the day of, or at least the day after the regulation was announced, and again, that will take a long time to implement. That regulation is probably premised on a constitutional provision called the Commerce Clause, which allows the federal government to act if there are multiple states impacted by commerce within the regulation. So Commerce Clause, right, is addressed in that Chamber of Commerce. They're experts on commerce litigation. The other thing that I think is really fundamental is whether or not Chevron deference will remain, and so that really will limit an enormous amount of specific federal agency actions, like this Federal Trade Commission ruling on whether or not non-competes can be banned. And so the bottom line effect, that's very legalese and in the weeds, is what the Federal Trade Commission says is going to happen as a result of this regulation is that it will lead to new business formation growing by 2.7% per year, resulting in more than 8,500 additional new businesses created each year. This rule is expected to result in higher earnings for workers, with estimated earnings increasing for the average worker by an additional $524 per year. And it is expected to lower healthcare costs by up to $194 billion over the next decade. So, those are not minimal effects. And I think it speaks to, especially in the healthcare industry, how prevalent, really good providers are under non-compete clauses within their contracts. And so, it's I think going to have an impact if it ever gets implemented. And I'm just sort of incredulous as to whether or not that will be tomorrow. The regulation itself says that it'll be implemented in 6 months. But I'm pretty confident that there will be a stay on the implementation of this regulation. So I think there's a lot of folks really interested in, oh my God, what does this mean? My bias, my perspective is it doesn't mean much right now. That there will be, some continued thought about this. But those projections from the FTC really are premised on the idea that there won't be successful litigation challenging this regulation. And I think there's very likely to be successful litigation on it. There's a fundamental question whether or not the FTC can really ban these under the Constitution. And I think we've had a real sea change in the Supreme Court's perspective on what the federal government's powers really are. Remember, if you go back to 8th grade civics, right, the idea is that the states are supreme, right? And we sort of fought a war over that. But there really is this question of what powers, enumerated powers and non-enumerated powers the federal government has. It might not have the authority, according to the current Supreme Court, or whatever's going to happen with the Supreme Court to enforce something that bans these types of contract clauses. The other thing, and not to get too DC, is we have an election coming up, right? And I think that this current antitrust robust regulatory regime with Lena Khan and some DOJ folks. Lena Khan's the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice also has antitrust jurisdiction. That might go away in a new administration. So, my old law school professor used to say it totally depended on the administration, whether or not there was going to be whether there was going to be antitrust enforcement versus not. And so that's the historic perspective is one party may be more interested in pursuing antitrust, breaking up big trusts. Ma Bell is a perfect example. That kind of stuff. I know it sounds very in the weeds, but I think it may have an effect on payment, contracting, really the bottom line for some practices, and their ability to attract the highest quality and most productive PTs. Right? There's going to be more of an open labor market for those folks if this regulation becomes reality or implementable or enforceable, and that I think is going to shake up some of this workforce challenge we've been having. Folks are going to be able to shop around for better pay, and that shifts the sort of balance of power within different physical therapy practices. The owners will be less able to sort of lock in the best PTs. So. Again, sorry to be so in the weeds. I don't know how we're going to cut that into 30-second giblets, but I do think it's important and sort of folks might want to keep it on the radar screen of how it might impact the practice and how it might impact their ability to get another job if they want to. Well, I would argue that it helps individuals the most. It probably hurts business owners the most. So PTs are going to have more freedom to be able to go and contract with whomever they'd like to and not be locked into something that says, hey, you can't compete within a 20-mile radius or whatever, during the terms of this contract, or even after the terms of the contract. Sometimes they're sort of in perpetuity, or not in perpetuity, but for some time afterward, the contracts can sort of lock in those folks and say, yeah, you can't get a job with the guy across the street. So that will mean that folks are going to have more opportunity, maybe to work with different practices, but at the same time, practices themselves, the sort of business owners or the even the large chains or large PT practices, they have problems right now attracting an adequate workforce that we talked about last time. It really does sort of split the labor folks from the ownership folks, and I think that's why it's hard for an organization like APTA perhaps to take a really clear position. We represent both, and I don't work for APTA. I work for APTA Private Practice and AOPT. But I think there are both folks within the memberships, right? There's business owners who are, who have built those PT practices from the ground up, often, or inherited them, or bought them, et cetera. And then there's the PTs on the front line, in addition to sometimes the business owners who, are going to have more ability to demand higher wages, go elsewhere. There's just going to be more efficient labor market stuff going on, and that probably will decrease some bottom lines as more folks are needing to be paid more. But again, this isn't happening tomorrow. Even the regulation says 6 months, and then beyond that, I think it'll take years to be really decided here by the current Supreme Court or a new one. And of course, the election is coming up too. It's this kind of in the weeds stuff that oftentimes can feel tangential or unimportant, but it really can have an impact over time on how folks run their practices and the kind of payment they can receive. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the GP modifier. Folks use this a lot of the time, and we've seen two large payers actually seem to state that acupuncturists can use this modifier, which is not the way it's supposed to work under the CPT guidelines. And so APTA and others are working on some letters to those large payers saying, actually, no, the GP modifier is actually only for physical therapists. And so acupuncturists, et cetera, can't use that because the rules bar them from it, especially for always PT services. So those payers are trying to suggest that that folks who are not PTs or speech therapists or occupational therapists can use the GP, GO, and GS modifiers. They really can't under the rules, but really CPT arguably does not bar payers from doing different policies. In fact, only in the E&M coding world are payers sort of controlled by CPT and by CMS guidelines. There is, however, a statement in the CMS manual that says that physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists are the only ones who can use these modifiers, right? So that's the basis of a letter we've written and are working on. We're very hopeful that the payers take note of this and that we defend the terms and titles that so many PTs have worked so hard to get. I mean, you're a doctorate level healthcare provider. Somebody else shouldn't be able to claim things that they're doing are physical therapy. They're not. And so this is the kind of stuff we do all the time at the association level, is try to get this kind of stuff stamped out because it's really very clear that the rules require that PTs are the only ones who can do this. So, we're working on that, and hopefully we'll see some movement out of some of those payers, generally on the West Coast, who are sort of pulling these shenanigans. One other thing that is going on is your AOPT is working on a number of stories, which we think, and from my experience, having worked on Capitol Hill, are always really, sadly, more persuasive than data to legislators and sometimes even to their staff. The way that this kind of information flows up to folks on Capitol Hill is through images and experiences that folks have on the front lines in PT, and that can be impacted by policy. So Anthony DeFilippo, who is the chair of a utilization management work group within the policy committee for AOPT, he has been working with his members of that work group just to collect stories, just to collect some of the impacts that have happened on PT practices and patients as a result of these really ludicrous policies that many payers have, requiring peer-to-peer, prior authorization every 4 visits, just all this stuff that people waste their time doing in fighting with the insurance company, dancing back and forth, trying to get paid for the services that they know these patients need. So it is something that I think can hopefully be persuasive. Again, based on some of these other videos, I think we're seeing more movement in the area of utilization management and prior authorization regulation than we've ever seen. And that's really applying to some of the groups that have federal payment flowing to them: Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, managed care, CHIP plans, even plans that list in the exchange. The feds are picking up part of that because they pick up 2 different tax credits that help people afford at a lower income out-of-pocket costs, and then at up to 400% of the federal poverty level, about $80,000 for a family of 4, maybe a little bit more now. Those folks, all of those folks below that who decide to get health insurance in the exchange, they get a tax credit to help them afford the premiums. So that's really pretty much the way the ACA works. The federal government stands in the shoes of an employer, and they help with the cost of premiums, and to some extent for lower income folks, 200% of the federal poverty level below, I believe, that is supported by out-of-pocket tax credits. So, that is important, I think, because where the federal government can have an impact, they're trying. The other hope is that once they do these regulations and they get implemented, it just becomes easier for the payers to have that apply across the board. So even in the same way that Medicare Part B or physician insurance, remember Part A is hospital, Part B is physician or other provider payments and insurance, Part C is Medicare Plus Choice or Medicare Advantage, used to be called Medicare Plus Choice, and then Part D is the drug benefit. The way that those 4 work, the feds have really, if you look at your Part B interaction with Medicare, there is no prior authorization, right? It's pretty clear what's allowed under Medicare Part B. It's really under Medicare Part C when HMOs and other payers come in to administer the benefit that they've imposed prior authorization. They've imposed peer-to-peer review. They've imposed these other things to try to decrease utilization and, I would argue, maximize their profits, right? They're making a lot of money off of Medicare Advantage. And so, you can see some some of these large payers just billions and billions of dollars flowing their way. The federal government recognizes that that is generally a result of denying patient care for utilization management or prior authorization reasons. And so they're trying to rein that in and say, prior authorization is not the way to be. That's certainly not what the federal government wanted to pay for, which is, people getting care. And certainly I think it's just, the insurance company is imposing a significant unpaid cost on physical therapists every time they ask for prior authorization or a peer-to-peer review, et cetera. It's really bunk that our members have to spend any of their time, which is, by the way, not reimbursed, trying to get the insurance company to pay for what is medically necessary. It's a really dumb system. And I think the feds are starting to recognize that. The idea that there's so much low quality care going on out there is, I think, overblown. And that's what we're here for, is to try to fight back against this sort of, I would say, overutilization of utilization management. So we're working on that, and gathering stories is very helpful in that advocacy. We can then use those on Capitol Hill. We can use those with payers when they come up with examples that are really unusual, and we can sort of push back on really fundamentally all of that. What it forgets is the patient, right? Especially in PT, you want to get that patient in there as quickly as you can after an injury or a problem, right? Every single time that care gets delayed, there is an impact on outcomes, right? So in the context of PT particularly, having delays is much more problematic than with other types of care. So it's a really dumb idea in PT in particular, and we're fighting against it in ways that we can, including gathering stories. And we're hoping maybe if we get a lot of those good stories to really open up the aperture and open up that floodgate of hearing from members about how beyond the utilization management work group, how prior authorization has impacted their practice and limited their ability to get paid and limited the care they can be reimbursed for. It's really, they know that patients are getting denied for medically necessary services. We need to gather those stories and then marshal them for the folks who can make decisions about what the rules are up here in Capitol Hill and in states. Two more things if we have the time. The first one is just a good news story. I got a call, I believe 2 weeks ago, from a PT who had been working in a peer-to-peer network, trying to understand what other PT practices were going through in their area and across the country. And this is it's a really good model for folks to be able to understand their business a little bit better and to succeed at advocating for increased payment. She realized that she had never reached out to her payers to try to negotiate the payment rates. Right, and it had been years of the exact same payment rate, in the range of $70 for the sort of normal services that folks in other parts of the country were getting more than double for that. And so, she was apoplectic. She called me and called up and was just interested in finding out what she should do. So we talked together about which payers she takes. I recommended that she look at the lowest payment rate group and then perhaps consider firing that group, right? If you get rid of 10% of your lowest payers every year, it's really scary, but it's a very effective way for folks to raise payment across the board because all of a sudden those patients can't get in the door anywhere if folks aren't willing to take really crummy payments. And so she decided, to reach out to this insurance company for the first time ever, even though she had their contract and, had the right person and was able to reach out. The insurance company immediately gave her a 5% raise, right? So I think what happens out there in the real world, not here in this DC bubble, is folks just take the contracts that they're given and they don't analyze what it means to have inflation costs, to have higher workforce costs, to have, higher overhead from materials and equipment. All that stuff is rising in price. We have a workforce shortage, so the prices of your services, of PT services, should rise as well. AOPT, I think, is a leader in so many things. We want to be a leader in payment as well. And the dirty little secret of that is I can do everything I can, but I can't negotiate for folks. So it really is important for PTs to get informed, know where their contracts are, know what their rates are, and then push back on really crummy rates that they get. Also consider firing, if you have a good case mix, firing some of your lowest payers sends a message. And especially for PT services, it's really an important thing to do for your patients. because even if patients can't get in because they have a payer that is crummy, they might then go to their HR department and say, hey, I really like this PT. Why can't I get in there anymore? And that HR department then has some leverage over the insurance company about whether or not they're able to continue using that insurance, that payer. So it is a complex system. It is something that can feel daunting, and it's certainly, I've not seen it work this well too often, but man, when it does, I mean, wouldn't you like a 5% raise for every single, service that you provide for these patients? It didn't get her to, double the rate like in some other places, but what you do is you just do that year after year after year, and your payment rates will rise. So we have some pretty basic strategies that were provided last time we did this with Robbie Leonard. You just got to ask, you got to have data, you got to know your market, and it's really, really important to do, because then you're able to provide better services, more efficient services, do all the stuff you really want to be doing if you get paid more per tick. Right, that's just the fundamental issue is that PT is paid too little. We don't fight back against bad contracts, and as a result, patients might not be getting. You can't give the best care. You can't see everyone because you just can't afford it. So it absolutely is important for PTs to negotiate this stuff, and we're seeing more and more success stories because folks are understanding they have to take this on and fight, but we're here to help. The final thing is Capitol Hill has reached out to us, and this is under the auspices of the Payment Consortium, about the MIPs program. And, they recognize that, just like we do, that it's a failure, right? It's something that has not moved the needle in terms of quality or payment. Folks are, generally avoiding the program if they are eligible for it. In fact, I believe the data is only 5% of PTs are actually required to join it. Then a lot of others, avoid it through, not having enough Medicare patients, or there's, uncontrollable circumstances. Like if you were a victim of that Change Healthcare problem that United had, there's an opportunity for you to look to avoid having to be in MIPS. And it's because MIPS has a dirty name, right? The juice has not been worth the squeeze in the way that MIPS has been implemented. So many PT practices have spent so much money on administrative junk to really report the information that CMS requires. The quality measures aren't good. The health IT doesn't work very well. But what we have is an opportunity to educate Capitol Hill about these problems. And you don't, the old saying in DC is, if you're not at the menu, you're on the table. Sorry, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And if that's the case, we need to be educating Capitol Hill about these problems, right? PTs know it, but the point is, Capitol Hill can do something about it. So we've got to educate them. I urge people to get involved with PT PAC, to get engaged with their government affairs committees for their chapters. And let us know, what the MIPS program has been like for you. I mean, I'm not sure I've heard any PT say this is a great program and it works really well for my patients. All I've really heard is it costs too much, it wastes my time, and I don't get paid anything what it costs to implement.